Hello, I'm pleased to present a modern language version of the H.P. Lovecraft classic, The Call of Cthulhu. Of course, the best way to experience this masterpiece is in its original form. A link to that version should be below. However, it's fair to say that Lovecraft's language can be a challenge, especially if you're younger or less familiar with older literary styles. This modern version aims to preserve the tense, creeping horror of the original, but in a style that's easier to follow. I hope you enjoy it. The Call of Cthulhu. Original story by H.P. Lovecraft. Part 1. The Horror in Clay. The most comforting thing in the world, I think, is that the human mind can't connect all the things it knows. We live on a quiet island of ignorance, surrounded by the dark ocean of the unknown. We weren't meant to explore too far into that darkness. Science hasn't done too much harm so far, because each field works on its own. But one day, if we ever put all the pieces together, we might discover terrifying truths about the universe and about our small and helpless place in it. When that happens, people might go insane from fear, or else run away from the truth and try to forget it. Some religious people have guessed that the universe is huge, and that our world and human life are just small, temporary parts of it. They've talked about strange things from the past, using words that would sound terrifying if they weren't hidden behind comforting beliefs. But that's not where I got the one horrible glimpse into the ancient past that still makes me feel cold when I think about it, and makes my dreams feel like nightmares. Like most frightening discoveries, this one came by accident. I just happened to put together two separate things, an old newspaper article and some notes left behind by a dead professor. I hope no one else ever connects those same pieces. If I live, I'll never share anything that might help someone follow that same path. I think the professor felt the same way. He probably would have destroyed his notes if he hadn't died so suddenly. It all began in the winter of 1926-27, when my great-uncle George Gamel Angel died. He was a retired professor of ancient languages at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. He was well known for his knowledge of old writing systems, and museums often asked him for help. So many people might remember hearing that he died at the age of 92. In the local area, people were especially interested because no one could explain how he died. He had been walking home from the Newport ferry when he suddenly collapsed. Some witnesses said he had been bumped into by a black sailor who had come out of one of the narrow, shadowy alleys on the steep hill, a shortcut from the waterfront to the professor's home on Williams Street. The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with him, but in the end they said he probably had a hidden heart condition, made worse by walking up the steep hill so fast. At the time, I believed that explanation, but now I'm not so sure. As his closest relative and the person in charge of his belongings, he had no wife or children. I had to sort through his papers. I moved all his files and boxes to my apartment in Boston. Most of what I found was normal research, and I planned to have it published by the American Archaeological Society. But there was one box that confused me, and I didn't want to show it to anyone. It was locked, and I couldn't find the key, until I remembered the key ring my uncle always carried in his pocket. Once I opened it, I found something even more confusing. What was I supposed to think about this strange clay carving and the collection of notes, ramblings, and newspaper clippings? Had my uncle, in his old age, started believing silly stories? I decided to find the strange artist who had created the carving, because it looked like he was the one who had disturbed my uncle's peace of mind. The carving was a rough rectangle, less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in size. It was clearly made recently, but the design didn't feel modern at all. Even the strangest styles of modern art, like cubism or futurism, don't usually copy the kind of strange patterns you see in ancient writing, and this definitely looked like writing. I was familiar with most of my uncle's papers and collections, but I couldn't recognize this type of writing or even guess what it might be related to. A Above the writing was a picture that clearly showed something, though the style made it hard to tell exactly what. It looked like a monster, something you might only see in a nightmare. To be honest, it reminded me of an octopus, a dragon, and a twisted human shape all at the same time. It had a soft, tentacled head, a strange, scaly body, and small wings. But it wasn't just the details that made it scary. It was the overall shape, the feeling it gave when you looked at it, that was so disturbing. In the background, there was a faint hint of huge, ancient buildings. The writing that came with it, along with a bundle of newspaper clippings, was in my great-uncle's usual handwriting, written clearly without fancy style. The main paper was titled Cthulhu Cult, the strange word printed in capital letters to make sure it wasn't misread. The text was split into two parts. The first was called 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island. The second was called Story of Inspector John R. Lrasse, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana. At 1908 American Archaeological Society meeting, notes on same, and Professor Webb's account. The rest of the papers were short notes. Some were about people's strange dreams. Others were quotes from mystical books and magazines, especially Atlantis and The Lost Lemuria by W. Scott Elliott. A few were notes about secret societies and hidden cults, with references to mythology and anthropology books, like The Golden Bough by James Frazer and The Witch Cult in Western Europe by Margaret Murray. The newspaper clippings mostly reported on strange mental illnesses and mass panic during the spring of 1925. The first part of the main document told a very strange story. On the 1st of March 1925, a thin, dark-haired young man came to visit Professor Angel. He looked nervous and excited, and brought with him the strange clay carving, which was still soft and freshly made. His business card said, Henry Anthony Wilcox. My uncle recognized the name. Wilcox was the youngest son of a well-known family he knew a little. He had been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and was living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building nearby. Wilcox was talented, but very odd. Even as a child, he had stood out for telling strange stories and describing odd dreams. He said he was psychically sensitive, but most people in the old, business-focused city just thought he was weird. He didn't socialize much, and over time had faded from local society. Now he only mixed with a small group of artists from out of town. Even the Providence Art Club, which preferred more traditional work, had given up on him. According to the professor's notes, during this first visit, the young sculptor suddenly asked for help identifying the strange writing on the carving. He spoke in a dreamy, dramatic way that seemed fake and made it hard to take him seriously. My uncle replied rather sharply, since the tablet was clearly fresh and had nothing to do with real archaeology. But then Wilcox gave an answer that impressed him so much he wrote it down word for word. It was poetic and strange, exactly the kind of thing Wilcox often said, as I later came to learn. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than ancient Tyre, or the thinking Sphinx, or garden-surrounded Babylon." That was when Wilcox began a rambling story that suddenly sparked a memory and grabbed the professor's full attention. There had been a small earthquake the night before, the biggest one New England had felt in years, and it had deeply affected Wilcox's imagination. When he went to sleep, he had a powerful dream of massive cities made from huge stone blocks and towering pillars, all covered in green slime and filled with a horrible sense of something hidden and evil. Strange writing covered the walls and pillars. From somewhere deep underground came a voice that wasn't a voice, just a chaotic feeling that seemed to take shape only in the imagination. He had tried to write it down as the strange jumble of letters, Cthulhu Fatan. That strange phrase triggered something in Professor Angel's memory. He began questioning the sculptor in detail and studied the carving with intense interest. Wilcox later said that my uncle blamed his old age for not recognizing the writing or the image more quickly. Many of his questions seemed strange, especially the ones asking if Wilcox was part of a secret cult or religious group. Wilcox was confused and didn't understand why the professor kept asking him to confess, even offering to keep everything secret if he would just admit it. Once the professor was sure that Wilcox had no idea what he was talking about, he became obsessed with getting more information. He insisted that Wilcox keep coming back to report any future dreams. Wilcox agreed, and according to the notes, he visited every day for a while. Each time, he told of strange new dreams, always about huge dark cities made of wet, slimy stone and some kind of underground voice or mind calling out in strange sounds that made no sense. The words that came up again and again were Cthulhu and Rilia. On the 23rd of March, the notes say, Wilcox didn't show up. When someone went to check on him, they found that he had fallen ill with a strange fever and been taken to his family's home on Waterman Street. During the night, he had cried out loudly, waking several other artists in the building. Since then, he had drifted between unconsciousness and wild, confused speech. My uncle immediately contacted the family and followed the case closely. He often visited Dr. Toby, the doctor treating Wilcox at his office on Thayer Street. The doctor said Wilcox's feverish mind kept returning to strange ideas. He sometimes shuddered when describing them. Wilcox kept repeating the same dream images as before, but also spoke wildly about a huge creature miles high that walked or moved heavily through the world. He never described it clearly, but his scattered, panicked words made Professor Angel believe it was the same monster Wilcox had tried to sculpt. Dr. Toby said that every time the young man mentioned this being, he soon collapsed in exhaustion. Strangely, his temperature wasn't very high, but everything else about his condition suggested a real fever, not just mental illness. On the 2nd of April, around 3 p.m., Wilcox's illness suddenly ended. He sat up in bed, surprised to find himself at home and completely unaware of anything that had happened, either in dreams or real life, since the night of the 22nd of March. The doctor said he was well, and 3 days later he returned to his apartment, but to Professor Angel he was no longer any use. The strange dreams were gone, and after a week of boring and ordinary dream reports, my uncle stopped keeping notes on them. That's where the first part of the manuscript ended. But some of the scattered notes mentioned in it made me think deeply, so deeply in fact, that only my strong skepticism at the time explains why I still didn't trust Wilcox. These notes described the dreams of other people during the same period when Wilcox had his strange experiences. It seems my uncle had quickly started a large investigation, asking almost everyone he could without being too forward to report their dreams to him, especially if anything unusual had happened in the past few weeks. Some people ignored him, but many responded, and far more than one person could have handled without help. The original letters weren't kept, but my uncle's notes created a detailed and important summary. Most ordinary people, people in business or social circles, what New Englanders might call solid citizens, had nothing unusual to report. A few mentioned some uneasy but vague impressions during sleep, and even those happened only between the 23rd of March and the 2nd of April, the exact time when Wilcox had been delirious. Scientists, too, seemed mostly unaffected, though 4 gave vague reports of strange landscapes in their dreams. One even described a feeling of fear about something unnatural. But it was from the artists and poets that the most interesting responses came. I believe panic would have broken out if they had been able to compare notes. Since I couldn't read their original letters, I sometimes wondered whether my uncle had asked leading questions or maybe shaped the responses to match what he already believed. That's why I still suspected that Wilcox, somehow aware of what my uncle already knew, had been trying to trick the old professor. Still, the reports from the artists were disturbing. From the 28th of February to the 2nd of April, many of them had intense and unusual dreams. These became much more vivid during the exact days when Wilcox was sick. More than a quarter of the artists described scenes and sounds similar to what Wilcox had reported. Some even admitted feeling terrified by a huge, nameless creature that appeared near the end of their dreams. One case, described in detail, was especially tragic. A well-known architect who had an interest in mysticism and the occult went violently insane on the same day Wilcox collapsed. He died a few months later, still screaming for someone to save him from a creature escaped from hell. If my uncle had listed the dreamers' names instead of just using numbers, I would have investigated more. As it was, I only managed to find a few of them, but all of them confirmed what the notes described. I often wonder whether the rest of the people my uncle questioned were as confused and frightened as the ones I found. Maybe it's a good thing they never learned the full truth. As I mentioned earlier, the newspaper clippings also talked about strange events, panic, and madness during this same time. Professor Angel must have used a news clipping service, because he had gathered articles from all over the world. One told of a man in London who jumped out of a window after screaming in the night. Another was a strange letter to a South American newspaper, written by a man claiming to have seen terrifying visions of the future. A report from California described a religious group that all dressed in white, waiting for some great fulfillment that never came. In India, local unrest was mentioned toward the end of March. In Haiti, there were more voodoo ceremonies than usual. Reports from Africa spoke of nervous whisperings. In the Philippines, American officers said certain tribes were acting strangely. In New York, a group of panicked Middle Eastern immigrants attacked police on the night of the 22nd of March. Wild rumors were also spreading in Western Ireland, and in Paris, a painter named Ardois Bonneau showed a disturbing artwork called Dream Landscape at the Spring Art Show of 1926. There were so many reports of strange cases in mental hospitals that it's amazing doctors didn't start comparing them and asking serious questions. It was a strange and disturbing collection of articles. Looking back now, I can hardly believe how calmly I dismissed it all at the time. But back then, I was still convinced that Wilcox had somehow learned about the old stories my uncle already knew. Part 2. The Tale of Inspector Lrasse. The older events that made Wilcox's dream and carving so important to my uncle were explained in the second half of his notes. It turns out that, once before, Professor Angel had seen the same terrible shape of the nameless monster, struggled to identify strange ancient writing, and heard the same chilling word, Cthulhu. It had all happened in such a shocking and disturbing way that it's no surprise he questioned Wilcox so urgently. That earlier event had taken place in 1908, 17 years earlier, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angel, being a respected expert, had taken an important role in the discussions. He was one of the first to be approached by a few outsiders who used the meeting as a chance to ask questions and get help from the experts. The most important of these visitors, and soon the center of everyone's attention, was a middle-aged man from New Orleans who looked quite ordinary. His name was John Raymond Lrasse, and he was a police inspector. He had traveled all the way to St. Louis to get help with something he couldn't explain on his own. With him he carried the reason for his visit, a disgusting, creepy statue made of stone, which seemed extremely old. No one could figure out where it had come from. It's important to say that Inspector Lrasse had no interest in archaeology. He was only looking for answers for professional reasons. The statue, whether it was an idol, a religious object, or something else, had been taken a few months earlier during a police raid in the swamps south of New Orleans. The raid had broken up what they thought was a voodoo ceremony, but the rituals the police found were far stranger and more disturbing than anything they had seen before. It quickly became clear they had uncovered a dangerous cult, one that was completely unknown to them and far more evil than any group they had ever dealt with. No one could explain where the statue had come from. The cult members told wild and unbelievable stories when questioned, but none of it helped. That's why the police were so eager to find someone who could identify the strange figure, and maybe use that knowledge to trace the cult to its source. Inspector Lrasse had no idea how big a reaction his statue would cause. As soon as the experts saw it, they became excited. They rushed over to get a closer look at the small figure, which was clearly very strange and very old. Its shape and style didn't match anything from known history, but it gave the strong impression that it came from an ancient, forgotten time. The stone surface was greenish and worn, and nobody could even say what kind of stone it was made of. But it seemed to carry the weight of centuries, maybe even thousands of years. The figure was passed slowly from person to person, so each could study it closely. It was about 7 or 8 inches tall and showed an amazing level of detail. It was a statue of a monster, shaped somewhat like a human, but with a head that looked like an octopus. Its face was a mass of tentacles. The body looked scaly and rubbery, with huge claws on both its hands and feet, and long, narrow wings sticking out from its back. The creature seemed full of an evil energy, and its shape was slightly swollen or bloated. It crouched in a horrible pose on a block-shaped base, which was covered in writing no one could read. The tips of its wings touched the back of the block. The body sat in the middle, while its crouching hind legs reached forward to grip the front edge. The long claws of these legs stretched part way down the side of the base. The creature's head bent forward, so that the ends of its facial tentacles brushed the backs of its huge front claws, which rested on its raised knees. There was something disturbingly lifelike about it. What made it truly frightening was that no one knew where it came from. It clearly seemed ancient, unbelievably ancient, yet it didn't resemble any known art style from early civilization. In fact, it didn't match any known period at all. It felt completely separate from anything human. Even the material it was made from was a mystery. The dark greenish-black stone had a soapy feel and was marked with golden or rainbow-like streaks. It didn't resemble any rock known to science or geology. The writing along the base was just as strange. Despite having some of the world's top experts in ancient languages in the room, not a single person could guess what language the symbols belonged to. Like the statue itself and the stone it was carved from, this writing seemed to come from something completely outside human history. It suggested an ancient alien world of life and thought that had nothing to do with ours. As the men admitted they had no idea what they were looking at, one person finally spoke up. He said the shape of the statue and its writing seemed oddly familiar to him. That man was the late William Channing Webb, a respected professor of anthropology at Princeton University and a well-known explorer. He explained, a little hesitantly, that he had once seen something similar. Nearly 50 years earlier, Professor Webb had been on a trip through Greenland and Iceland, searching for old Viking runes. He hadn't found any, but while travelling along the remote western coast of Greenland, he had discovered a strange tribe of Inuit people. They followed a religion unlike any he had seen before, a violent and disturbing form of devil worship that shocked even him. It was a faith that other Inuit barely spoke of, and when they did, they only mentioned it with fear. They claimed it came from a time before the world was made. The tribe performed terrible rituals, including human sacrifice. Their ceremonies were directed at a mysterious, ancient being they called a Tornasuk, some kind of elder demon. Professor Webb had made careful notes, including a written version of their chants, based on what an old shaman told him. He used Roman letters to write down the sounds as accurately as he could. But most important of all was the object the tribe worshipped. They danced around it when the northern lights flashed in the sky above the ice cliffs. It was a rough stone carving, badly made, but clearly showing a terrifying figure and some strange writing. As far as Professor Webb could tell, it was a basic version of the very same creature they were all now examining. This information shocked everyone in the room. Inspector Lrasse was especially excited and immediately began questioning the professor. During the raid in Louisiana, his team had arrested several cult members, and he had written down a chant they used during their rituals. Now he asked Professor Webb if he could remember the words he had recorded from the Inuit worshippers. The two men compared details carefully, and then came a long, stunned silence. Both realized that the two chants, spoken by two different groups in two far-apart corners of the world, were nearly identical. What both the Inuit shamans and the swamp priests had said in their own rituals was something very close to this. Funglui Muglunafer Cthulhu Rillier Wuchnach Fuchtang. Lrasse had one advantage. Some of the cultists arrested in Louisiana had told him what they thought the words meant. According to them, the translation went something like this: "In his house at Rillier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming." At this point, in response to strong interest from the group, Inspector Lrasse told the full story of his experience with the swamp cult. I could tell that my uncle thought it was deeply important. The story sounded like something from a dream or a strange legend, and it revealed a surprising level of cosmic imagination from the kind of outcasts and misfits you wouldn't expect to think in such grand, disturbing ways. On the 1st of November 1907, the New Orleans police received a panic message from the swamp and lagoon region to the south of the city. The people living there, descendants of old pirates and settlers, mostly poor but generally harmless, were terrified. Something had come into their lives at night, something unknown and terrifying. It seemed like voodoo, but a far darker kind than anyone had seen before. Some of the women and children had disappeared since a steady drumbeat had begun echoing from deep within the dark woods no one dared to enter. People spoke of insane shouting, horrifying screams, and chilling chants. They saw flames dancing in the night. The messenger said the community couldn't take it anymore. So, a team of 20 police officers set out that same afternoon. They took 2 carriages and an automobile, and the frightened man who had brought the message went with them to guide the way. When the road ended, they got out and continued on foot, marching for miles through the silent, creepy cypress forest where sunlight never reached. The air was thick with roots, Spanish moss hanging like ropes, and strange piles of stones or ruins that gave the feeling someone or something had once lived there. Eventually, they reached the squatter village, a miserable group of huts. People came running out, gathering around the bobbing lanterns in fear. Far off in the distance, they could hear the beat of the drums. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, they heard awful screams. A strange red glow also seemed to flicker beyond the forest, hidden behind endless trees and tangled undergrowth. None of the villagers were willing to go any farther. Too scared to even be left alone, they still refused to move one more step toward the place of worship. So Inspector Lrasse and his 19 men pressed on without a guide, entering a part of the swamp so dark and wild that no one had ever dared go there before. This area had a reputation. It was said to be cursed, a place almost no white men had ever visited. The local people whispered about a hidden lake, never seen by any living person, where a huge, shapeless white creature with glowing eyes was said to live. They claimed that bat-winged devils came out of deep caves underground to worship it at midnight. They said the thing had been there long before d'Iberville, before LaSalle, before the Native Americans, even before animals and birds had lived in the forest. It was the stuff of nightmares. Just seeing it, they said, would kill you. But it entered dreams, and that was enough to keep people away. The ceremony the police were walking toward was held on the very edge of this dreaded place, but even that was bad enough. Maybe it was the location itself that scared the villagers rather than the sounds. What the police heard as they got closer was too strange for words. Only poetry or madness could fully describe the noises. Some sounds clearly came from human voices, others seemed like animals. But when you heard a human voice making animal noises, or the other way around, it was deeply disturbing. The wild celebration had risen to terrifying heights. There were howls and screeches that echoed through the dark woods like a storm full of sickness blowing in from hell. Now and then, the chaotic screaming would stop. Then a group of deep, harsh voices would chant in rhythm. It was that same horrible phrase, Funglui Muglunafer, Cthulhu Rillier, Wuchnach Fuchtang. Finally, the police reached a spot where the trees were thinner, and suddenly they saw the ceremony with their own eyes. 4 of the men staggered back in shock. 1 fainted. 2 screamed in fear, though their cries were drowned out by the insane noise of the ritual. Lrasse splashed swamp water onto the fainted officer's face, and the rest stood frozen, shaking with fear. All of them were nearly hypnotized by the horror of what they were seeing. In a natural clearing in the swamp was a grassy island, about an acre wide. It had no trees and was fairly dry. Here, a chaotic group of strange-looking people leapt and twisted around a huge ring-shaped bonfire. The sight was beyond description, more disturbing than anything except perhaps a nightmare painting. The worshippers wore no clothes. This mixed group of people shrieked, bellowed, and moved wildly in a dance of madness. In the center of the fire stood a tall granite pillar, about 8 feet high. From time to time, gaps in the flames showed it clearly. On top of it, looking strangely small by comparison, sat the horrible carved statue. Around the pillar stood 10 wooden scaffolds, spaced evenly in a wide circle. Hanging upside down from each one were the missing squatters, their bodies strangely marked. Inside this circle of hanging bodies, the dancers spun and screamed, always moving in a clockwise circle between the ring of flames and the ring of the dead. Their movements were wild, their voices horrifying. One of the police officers, a nervous man named Joseph D. Galvez, later claimed he had heard something else, voices answering the ritual from somewhere deep in the woods. He even said he heard the faint sound of beating wings and caught a glimpse of glowing eyes and a huge white shape behind the farthest trees. I spoke to him later. He was highly imaginative, and I suspect he had been influenced by too many local superstitions. The police didn't wait long. Their horror was real, but duty came first. Even though there were nearly 100 worshippers, Lrasse and his men relied on their weapons and charged straight into the chaos. For 5 minutes, the scene was a blur of noise and violence. Fists flew, shots were fired, and some cultists escaped. But in the end, Lrasse had captured 47 prisoners. He forced them to quickly dress and line up between the officers. 5 cultists were dead, and 2 others were badly hurt and carried away by their own people. The statue was removed from the monolith and taken back by Lrasse for study. After a long and exhausting journey back, the prisoners were questioned at police headquarters. All of them were found to be people of low intelligence and mixed backgrounds. Most were sailors. A number had African or Caribbean roots, mainly West Indian or Brava Portuguese from Cape Verde, which gave the group a voodoo-like appearance. But it quickly became clear that this cult was something much older and stranger than any traditional folk religion. Despite their poor education and confused minds, the cultists were shockingly consistent in what they believed. They worshipped the Great Old Ones, beings who lived long before humans existed and who came to Earth from the stars. These Old Ones were gone now, buried deep in the earth and beneath the sea. But their dead bodies still passed knowledge to the first humans through dreams. These first dreamers created a secret cult that had never disappeared. The cultists said their group had always existed, and always would. They stayed hidden in far-off places, waiting for the day when Cthulhu, the great priest of the Old Ones, would rise again from his dark house in the sunken city of R'lyeh. When the stars were right, he would wake, and the cult would help him take over the world again. They refused to say anything more. Some knowledge, they claimed, could never be spoken, not even under torture. Humans, they insisted, were not the only intelligent beings on Earth. Strange shapes came from the darkness to visit the faithful, but these were not the Old Ones themselves. No human had ever seen the great Old Ones. The carved figure was Cthulhu, but no one could say if the others looked the same. No one could read the writing anymore, but stories had been passed down by word of mouth. The chant itself wasn't a secret. It was repeated aloud, but the true knowledge was whispered only in private. The chant simply meant, "In his house at R'lyeh, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming." Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged. The rest were sent to mental hospitals. All of them denied taking part in the killings. They claimed the deaths were caused by black-winged ones, who came to them from their ancient meeting place in the haunted woods, but no one ever got a clear explanation of these supposed allies. Most of what the police learned came from one man, a very old cultist named Castro, who had mixed ancestry and said he had travelled to strange places. He claimed to have spoken with immortal leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered parts of an ancient legend, stories so strange and terrifying that they made normal myths seem tame and made humans and Earth feel young and unimportant by comparison. He said there had been ages, long before humans existed, when other beings ruled the Earth. These beings had built huge cities. The deathless Chinese cult leaders he'd spoken with told him that some remains of those cities could still be found, giant stone ruins on remote Pacific islands. These beings had all died long before people appeared on Earth, but there were special arts that could bring them back to life when the stars returned to the right positions in the endless cycles of the universe. These creatures had come from the stars themselves, and they had brought statues of themselves when they arrived. Castro explained that the Great Old Ones, as they were called, were not made entirely of flesh and blood. They had forms, as proven by the strange statue, but they weren't made of normal matter. When the stars were in the right places, they could move between worlds through space. But when the stars were wrong, they couldn't survive. Even though they no longer lived, they had never truly died. They now lay in stone tombs in their great city R'lyeh, preserved by the powerful spells of Cthulhu, their high priest. They waited there in silence for the day when the stars and the earth would once again be ready for them, but they could not free themselves alone. Some outside force would be needed to unlock their tombs. The same spells that kept their bodies whole also kept them from acting on their own, so they could only lie in darkness, fully conscious, thinking and waiting while millions of years passed. They knew everything happening in the universe, and their form of communication was telepathic. Even now they still spoke in their graves. When the first humans finally appeared, the Great Old Ones reached out to those with sensitive minds by sending thoughts into their dreams, because that was the only way their language could reach the minds of physical creatures like us. Castro said those early humans created a cult around small statues the Great Old Ones had shown them. Statues brought from far-off stars in ancient times. That cult never died. It would survive until the stars were right again, and then the secret priests would raise great Cthulhu from his tomb and awaken the others, so they could rule the earth once more. When that time came, it would be obvious. By then, humans would have become like the Old Ones, wild and free beyond good and evil, with no laws or morals. People would be shouting and killing and celebrating in wild joy. Then the Old Ones would teach humanity new ways to scream and kill and enjoy themselves. The entire world would burn in a wild fire of freedom and madness. Until that day came, the cult had to keep the memory of the old ways alive, through rituals that hinted at the return of their masters. In ancient times, special humans had been able to speak with the Old Ones in dreams, but something had happened. The great city of Relia, with its stone towers and tombs, had sunk beneath the ocean. The deep sea, filled with the first great mystery, through which even thought could not travel, cut off the dream connection. But the memory of the Old Ones didn't die. The high priests of the cult said the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then strange beings, called the black spirits of the earth, would come up from underground. They were shadowy, rotten things full of ancient secrets whispered in caves beneath long-forgotten seafloors. But Castro didn't want to talk much about them. He stopped suddenly, and no amount of pressure or clever questioning could get him to say more. He also refused to say how big the Old Ones really were. As for the cult itself, Castro said its center might be in the desert of Arabia, in a lost place called Iram, the city of pillars. The cult had no connection to the European witch cults, and almost no one outside of it knew it existed. No normal books had ever mentioned it. But the deathless Chinese cult leaders claimed there were hidden meanings in the Necronomicon, the book written by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. These hidden meanings could only be seen by the initiated. One couplet from that book was quoted often: "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." Lrasse was deeply impressed, and also deeply confused. He had asked many questions, but couldn't find any real historical connection for this cult. Castro seemed to be telling the truth when he said it had always remained completely secret. The experts at Tulane University had no knowledge of the cult or the statue. So now Lrasse had come to the highest authorities in the country, and still, the only link he had was the Greenland tale told by Professor Webb. The intense interest caused by Lrasse's story, and confirmed by the strange statue, was remembered for a long time by those at the meeting, even if it was barely mentioned in the Society's official publications. Scholars are cautious, especially when dealing with things that might turn out to be fakes. For a while, Lrasse lent the statue to Professor Webb, but after Webb's death, it was returned to him. I saw it not long ago, and it is truly a terrifying object, clearly related to the dream carving made by young Wilcox. I was not surprised that my uncle had been so fascinated by Wilcox's story. Imagine hearing of a young man who dreamed not only of a strange figure, but of the exact symbols found both on the swamp cult's idol and on Professor Webb's Greenland tablet, and who even used 3 of the same mysterious words spoken by both the Inuit devil worshippers and the Louisiana cultists. No wonder Professor Angel launched such a thorough investigation. Yet privately, I suspected Wilcox of having somehow heard rumors of the cult and of inventing his dream stories to impress my uncle. Although the professor's dream records and newspaper clippings were compelling, my rational mind preferred the simplest explanation. So, after studying the manuscript carefully and comparing its anthropological notes with Lrasse's story, I decided to travel to Providence and confront the sculptor. I felt he deserved a stern warning for deceiving an elderly scholar. Wilcox was still living alone in the Fleur-de-Lis building on Thomas Street, a gloomy Victorian imitation of old Breton architecture. It stood awkwardly among the beautiful colonial houses of the old hill, beneath the shadow of America's finest Georgian church steeple. I found him in his room, working. Even at a glance, the strange clay pieces scattered about showed that his talent was real. I believe he will one day be recognized as a great, if dark, artist, for in his clay, and, one day, in marble, he has captured the very nightmares and visions that Arthur Machen writes about in prose, and Clark Ashton Smith brings to life in poetry and painting. Wilcox was thin, pale, and a little untidy in appearance. He turned lazily at my knock and asked what I wanted without standing. When I introduced myself, he showed some curiosity. My uncle had questioned him closely about his dreams, but had never explained why. I did not tell him any more than I had to, but I tried carefully to draw him out. In a short time, I became convinced of his sincerity. The way he spoke of his dreams left no doubt that he believed in them. These dreams had deeply shaped his art, and he showed me a disturbing sculpture, so dark and powerful that I felt a shiver just looking at it. He said he could not remember seeing the original figure, except in his dreams, but the form had come naturally to his hands as he worked. It was probably the same huge shape he had raved about in his delirium. He made it clear that he knew nothing of the cult, except for what my uncle might have accidentally revealed during his questions. I still tried to figure out how he might have received these strange impressions. He spoke about his dreams in a strangely poetic way, describing with vivid clarity a massive city of wet, green stone, its angles and shapes all wrong, and the endless half-heard voice calling from deep underground, "Cthulhu ftang, Cthulhu ftang." These were the words of the ritual chant that spoke of Cthulhu's deathless dream in the sunken city of R'lyeh. Even as a skeptic, I felt unsettled. I convinced myself that Wilcox had once read or overheard some fragment of the cult's stories and forgotten it consciously, but that it had returned in his subconscious, shaping his dreams and art. If he had misled my uncle, it was innocent. The young man's manner was somewhat pretentious and odd, but I had to admit both his talent and his honesty. I left him on friendly terms, wishing him success. The mystery of the cult, however, continued to grip me. I even dreamed of gaining fame by uncovering its history and secret connections. I visited New Orleans, spoke with Lrasse and members of the old police raid, saw the statue again, and questioned the few surviving cultists. Sadly, old Castro was long dead. What I learned firsthand only confirmed what my uncle had written, but it reignited my interest. I became convinced that I had stumbled upon something real, a hidden religion, ancient and terrifying, which, if revealed, would make me a noted anthropologist. Yet, I stubbornly clung to my rational outlook. I dismissed, without good reason, the uncanny links between Wilcox's dreams and my uncle's records. But one thought grew stronger in my mind, and now I fear it is the truth. My uncle's death may not have been natural. He fell in a narrow sloping street leading up from the waterfront after being bumped by a black sailor. I cannot ignore the mixed blood and maritime nature of the cultists in Louisiana. Could the cult have agents with methods as deadly and as old as the rites they perform? Lrasse and his men have been left alone, but in Norway a certain sailor who had seen strange things is now dead. Could it be that my uncle's investigations, after learning of Wilcox's dreams, reached dangerous ears? I believe Professor Angel died because he knew too much, or was close to learning too much. Whether I will share his fate, I cannot yet say. I have learned much since then, and more remains to be discovered. Part 3. The Madness from the Sea. If heaven ever wanted to do me a favour, it would let me forget the moment I randomly looked at a piece of old shelf paper. That small accident changed everything. It wasn't something I would have come across in my normal life. It was an old issue of an Australian newspaper, the Sydney Bulletin, dated the 18th of April 1925. Somehow, it had escaped the attention of the news clipping service that had once been collecting materials for my uncle's research. By this point, I had mostly given up looking into what Professor Angel had called the Cthulhu cult. I was visiting a well-educated friend in Paterson, New Jersey, a museum curator and a respected expert in rocks and minerals. One day, while going through some extra mineral samples stored on shelves in a back room of the museum, I noticed a strange picture printed on one of the old papers used as shelf lining. It was that issue of the Sydney Bulletin, and the picture was a half-tone image of a disturbing stone idol, almost exactly like the one Inspector Lrasse had found in the Louisiana swamp. I quickly cleared off the samples sitting on top of it, and read the article with great interest. At first, I was a little disappointed. It wasn't very long. But what it hinted at was incredibly important to my nearly forgotten investigation. I carefully tore it out and set it aside at once. Here is what it said. Mystery ship found at sea. Vigilant arrives with helpless armed New Zealand yacht in tow. One survivor and dead man found aboard. Tale of desperate battle and deaths at sea. Rescued seaman refuses details of strange experience. Odd idol found in his possession. Inquiry to follow. The Morrison Company's freighter Vigilant, on its way from Valparaiso, arrived this morning at its dock in Darling Harbour. In tow, it brought a damaged and partly disabled but heavily armed steam yacht, the Alert of Dunedin, New Zealand. The Alert had been spotted on the 12th of April at sea at South 3421, West 15217, with 1 man alive and 1 dead aboard. The Vigilant had left Valparaiso on the 25th of March. On the 2nd of April, it was pushed far south off course by huge storms and massive waves. On the 12th of April, the crew spotted the damaged yacht. At first, it looked abandoned, but when they boarded it, they found 1 man alive, barely sane, and another who had clearly been dead for over a week. The survivor was clutching a horrible stone idol, about a foot tall, with a design no one could identify. Experts at Sydney University, the Royal Society, and the College Street Museum all admitted they had no idea what it was. The survivor claimed he had found it in the cabin of the yacht, sitting in a small carved shrine of a type often seen in the Pacific. Once the man had recovered enough to talk, he told a very strange story. His name was Gustaf Johansson, a Norwegian with some education who had served as second mate on the Emma, a 2-masted schooner from Auckland. The Emma had set sail for Callao on the 20th of February with a crew of 11. Johansson said the Emma was delayed and blown far south off course by the powerful storm of the 1st of March. Then, on the 22nd of March at South 4951, West 12834, they encountered the Alert, which was crewed by a strange and threatening group of Pacific Islanders and people of mixed heritage. The Emma was ordered to turn back, but Captain Collins refused. The Alert crew then opened fire without warning, using powerful brass cannons. The Emma's crew fought back. Even though their ship was sinking from hits below the waterline, they managed to pull alongside the Alert and board it. A violent fight broke out on the yacht's deck. The enemy crew was slightly larger in number and fought with wild, almost desperate fury, though their style was unskilled. In the end, the Emma's crew killed them all. 3 men from the Emma died in the fight, including Captain Collins and First Mate Green. The remaining 8 men, led by Second Mate Johansson, decided to keep sailing the captured yacht forward, curious to learn why the Alert's crew had tried to stop them. The next day, they reached a small island and went ashore, though no island is supposed to exist in that part of the ocean. 6 of the 8 men died there, though Johansson gave few details and only said they fell into a rock chasm. Later, he and the last surviving crewmate, William Bryden, got back aboard the Alert and tried to sail her again. But the storm of the 2nd of April struck them hard, and from then until the 12th of April, Johansson remembered very little. He couldn't even say when Bryden died. The cause of Bryden's death is unclear, but was likely due to stress or exposure. News reports from Dunedin said the Alert was well known there as a trader that sailed between islands and that it had a bad reputation. It was owned by a strange group of mixed heritage people who held mysterious meetings and made frequent trips into the woods at night. The yacht had left suddenly after the storm and earthquake of the 1st of March. Reports from Auckland praised the Emma and its crew. Johansson was described as a serious and trustworthy man. The Admiralty planned to start a full investigation the next day and officials hoped Johansen would give a clearer account of the strange events. That was the full article, along with the photo of the disturbing idol, but what a storm of thoughts it started in my mind. Here was new evidence about the Cthulhu cult, and signs that it had interests not only on land, but at sea. Why had the strange crew ordered the Emma to turn back? What was the mysterious island where 6 men died, and why was Johansen so secretive about it? What had the Admiralty's investigation revealed? What more was known about the cult in Dunedin? And most strange of all, what deep and unnatural connection between dates could explain the pattern that my uncle had tracked so carefully? The timing of everything was too perfect to ignore. It now seemed impossible to deny that something far beyond coincidence was at work. The 1st of March, our the 28th of February, because of the international dateline, was the day of the earthquake and storm. From Dunedin, the Alert and its sinister crew had rushed out to sea, as if urgently summoned. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, poets and artists had begun dreaming of a strange, wet, and ancient city. A young sculptor had even shaped the figure of Cthulhu in his sleep. On the 23rd of March, the crew of the Emma landed on a mysterious island, losing 6 men, and on that same day, the dreams of sensitive people became more vivid and terrifying, filled with a monstrous presence. An architect went mad. The sculptor collapsed into fever. Then there was the storm on the 2nd of April, the very day the dreams stopped, and Wilcox recovered from his strange illness. What did it all mean? What about the things old Castro had said about the sunken, star-born old ones, their return, and their power to influence dreams? Was I on the edge of some cosmic truth too terrible to bear? If so, I hoped it was only a horror of the mind. Something about that storm on the 2nd of April had put an end to the nightmare influence, at least for now. That evening, after a day of frantic telegrams and planning, I said goodbye to my host and took a train to San Francisco. Within a month, I arrived in Dunedin, but I found little information there. No one knew much about the strange cult members who had once hung around the old sea taverns. Men of mixed heritage were a common sight on the docks, so they hadn't attracted special attention. There were vague stories of a trip they made inland, when people saw red flames and heard faint drumming in the distant hills, but no real details. In Auckland, I learned that Johansen had returned after a short, fruitless questioning in Sydney. His blonde hair had turned white. He sold his cottage on West Street and sailed with his wife back to his home city, Oslo. He refused to say anything more than what he'd told the authorities, but I was able to get his address from one of his old friends. I then travelled to Sydney. I spoke with sailors and Vice Admiralty officials, but they had little more to offer. I saw the Alert, now sold for commercial use, sitting at Circular Quay in Sydney Cove, but the ship told me nothing. I also visited the Hyde Park Museum, where the crouching idol, with its octopus head, dragon-like body, scaled wings, and strange writing, was kept. I studied it for a long time. Its craftsmanship was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. Its material was unlike anything known. Geologists were baffled. They swore the stone wasn't found anywhere on Earth. Then I remembered what old Castro had said. They had come from the stars and had brought their images with them. Shaken as never before, I resolved to visit Johansen in Oslo. I sailed to London, then caught the next boat to Norway. One autumn day, I arrived at the neat harbour beneath the shadow of Egeberg Hill. His address was in the old town, once known as Oslo, even while the rest of the city went by the name Christiana. I took a taxi to a small, old plastered building and knocked at the door, my heart pounding. A sad-looking woman dressed in black answered. She spoke halting English and gave me bad news. Gustaf Johansen was dead. She said the events at sea in 1925 had broken him. He had never told her anything more than he told the authorities. but he had left behind a long manuscript in English, full of what he called technical matters. He had written it that way to protect her from the horror he'd experienced. He had died in a strange accident. While walking near the docks in Gothenburg, a bundle of papers fell from a high window and struck him on the head. 2 Lascar sailors helped him up, but he died before the ambulance arrived. The doctors could find no obvious cause, just said it was heart failure and a weak constitution. Now, for the first time, I felt true fear, a cold, creeping dread that hasn't left me since. Was his death really an accident? Or had he, like my uncle, learned too much? I convinced the widow that I had a valid reason to see the manuscript. She gave it to me, and I started reading it on the ship back to London. It was a rambling, simple document, just a sailor's diary, trying to make sense of terrifying days at sea. I won't copy the whole thing here, since much of it is unclear and repetitive, but I will summarize what matters. Johansen, thank heaven, didn't fully understand what he had seen, but he had seen the city and the thing, and now, because of his account, I can never sleep peacefully again. I know now that something ancient and horrible lies just behind the veil of what we call reality, something that exists beyond time and space, something that sleeps beneath the sea. It was born among the stars, and it dreams in the dark, and worst of all there is a cult, mad and faithful, ready to free it the moment an earthquake lifts its sunken city to the surface once more. Johansen's voyage began just as he described it to the Vice Admiralty officials. The Emma, sailing with no cargo, left Auckland on the 20th of February and soon ran into the full force of that earthquake-born storm, the same one that likely raised horrors from the ocean floor and invaded the dreams of men. Once the ship had weathered the storm and regained control, it continued smoothly until the 22nd of March when it was intercepted by the Alert. Johansen's writing shows clear regret as he describes the Emma's bombardment and sinking. He speaks of the dark-skinned cultists aboard the Alert with obvious fear. There was something so deeply unnatural about them that killing them had felt almost like a duty. Johansen seems confused that the court of inquiry later accused them of being too ruthless. Pushed forward by curiosity, the survivors took command of the captured yacht, now under Johansen's leadership. Then they spotted a strange stone pillar rising from the sea. At South 47-9 and West 126-43, they came upon a bizarre coastline, a slimy mix of mud, weeds, and massive stone structures. What they had found could be nothing other than the physical remains of Earth's most dreadful legend, the corpse city of Rilia, built long before history began by monstrous beings that had come from the stars. This was where great Cthulhu lay, hidden deep in green, slimy vaults. After countless ages, he was finally sending out thoughts to haunt the dreams of the sensitive and summon his followers for a ritual of release and restoration. Johansen had no idea of any of this, but what he did witness was enough. It's likely that only one mountain-like peak had risen from the sea, the one that held the giant monolithic tomb of Cthulhu. When I think about how much more might still lie hidden beneath the waves, I almost wish I could end my life right now. Johansen and his men were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the ancient city, its dripping, alien grandeur. Without being told, they somehow sensed it didn't belong to this world, or any sane reality. His fear is clear as he describes the enormous greenish blocks of stone, the towering carved monolith, and the eerie resemblance of the massive statues to the idol they had found aboard the Alert. Johansen may not have known what futurism was, but his words come close to describing it. He didn't talk about specific buildings or structures. Instead, he described strange impressions, vast surfaces, unnatural angles, and symbols that felt wrong. These surfaces were too massive and too strange to belong to anything built by humans. I mention his talk of angles because it reminded me of something Wilcox had said during his dreams. He spoke of strange, impossible geometry, non-Euclidean shapes, full of odd curves and alien dimensions. And now, here was an uneducated sailor describing the same thing after seeing it in reality. Johansen and his men landed on a sloping mud bank and scrambled up enormous slippery stone blocks. These weren't natural steps. No human hand could have shaped them. Even the sunlight seemed twisted and distorted, filtered through a heavy, unnatural mist that poured out from the city. The carved rock seemed to shift as you looked at it, with angles that played tricks on the eyes, one moment curving inward, the next bulging outward. The crew were already spooked before they saw anything more than mud, seaweed, and bizarre architecture. Each man wanted to run, but pride kept them from fleeing. They searched the area half-heartedly, hoping to find some small item they could take back with them, but found nothing at first. Then Rodriguez, the Portuguese sailor, climbed up to the base of a massive stone and shouted out. The others joined him, and found an enormous carved door featuring the now familiar squid dragon symbol of Cthulhu. Johansen said it was like a huge barn door, and they all sensed it was indeed a door, thanks to the frame, the decorated lintel, and the heavy threshold, but they couldn't figure out its orientation. Was it flat like a trap door, or slanted like a storm cellar? Nothing seemed to line up properly. As Wilcox might have put it, the geometry of the place was all wrong. The sea and land didn't appear horizontal, and nothing else seemed to sit properly in relation to them. Everything looked unreal, as though the laws of space itself had been warped. Bryden pushed at the stone door in several places, but nothing happened. Then Donovan felt carefully around the edges, pressing each spot as he went. He climbed slowly along the twisted stone border, which seemed to stretch endlessly. It might have been called climbing, if anyone could tell whether the thing was really vertical or not. The men wondered how any door could be so enormous. Then, softly and slowly, the huge panel began to move inward at the top. It was perfectly balanced. Donovan slid, or somehow made his way, down or along the doorframe, and rejoined the others. They watched in stunned silence as the gigantic carved door swung open at a strange diagonal angle, twisting the laws of shape and space as it went. Inside was pure blackness, so deep and unnatural that it felt almost solid. It wasn't just the absence of light, it seemed to push back, hiding even the inner walls that should have been visible. It poured outward like smoke from some ancient prison, dimming the sun as it drifted off into the warped sky on flapping leathery wings. The smell from within was unbearable. Then Hawkins, who had sharp ears, thought he heard a sickening wet sound from below. Everyone went silent, listening. And they were still listening when it appeared, slithering into view, forcing its enormous slimy green bulk through the opening and out into the tainted air of that nightmarish city. Johansen's handwriting nearly broke down at this point. Of the 6 men who never made it back to the ship, he believed that 2 died instantly, killed by sheer terror in that cursed moment. The creature cannot truly be described. No words exist for such insane chaos, for something that breaks the rules of matter, physics, and reality itself. A mountain seemed to move or stumble. My God, no wonder an architect went mad, and Wilcox was seized by fever the moment this happened, as if they felt it across the world through some horrible connection. This was the creature from the idols, the green, slimy spawn of the stars. It had awakened. The stars were right again, and the thing which its cult had tried for centuries to free had been released by accident, thanks to a group of unlucky sailors. After countless ages, Cthulhu was loose once more, and hungry for madness and destruction. 3 men were snatched by the thing's bloated claws before anyone could even react. May they rest in peace, if rest is possible anywhere in this universe. They were Donovan, Guerrera, and Ångström. Parker fell behind as the others ran in panic over the endless moss-covered stones. Johansen swore he saw Parker vanish into an impossible angle between the blocks, an angle that looked sharp but somehow acted like it was wide. Only Bryden and Johansson made it to the boat. They rowed frantically toward the Alert, while the enormous monster slithered down the slimy steps and paused at the water's edge. Luckily, steam pressure hadn't completely dropped, even though the crew had gone ashore. In a frenzy, Johansson rushed between the engine and the wheel and managed to get the yacht moving. Slowly, through the warped and hideous scenery, the Alert began to churn through the black water. Meanwhile, on the shore that was not of earth, the Titan creature slobbered and howled like Polyphemus raging at Odysseus's ship, but even bolder than the legendary Cyclops. Cthulhu slid into the sea and began swimming after them, each stroke sending up towering waves. Bryden looked back and went mad. He laughed and kept laughing, even after they were safe, until death finally took him one night in the cabin while Johansson drifted in a haze of shock. But Johansson had not given up. He knew Cthulhu would catch them easily, unless the steam engine reached full power. So, in desperation, he set the engine to full speed, ran to the deck, and spun the wheel hard, driving the Alert straight back toward the pursuing monster. The water boiled and frothed as the yacht rushed forward. The massive, squid-headed beast rose out of the waves, nearly touching the bow with its writhing tendrils, but Johansson didn't flinch. He rammed the ship directly into the creature. There was a horrible burst, like a balloon popping, followed by a splash of slime like a torn sea creature. A stench like 1,000 graves opened at once, and a noise so awful Johansson refused to describe it. For a moment, the ship was covered in a foul, green mist. Then, behind them, the sea hissed and churned, because unbelievably, the monster's scattered body was starting to reform, slowly pulling itself back together. But they were already speeding away. The distance between them and the creature grew with every second, as the steam pressure climbed and the Alert gained momentum. That was the end of the nightmare. Afterward, Johansson sat in the cabin, staring at the idol and tending to food for himself and the still laughing Bryden. He didn't try to steer anymore. Something inside him had broken. Then came the storm of the 2nd of April, and a black curtain seemed to fall over his mind. He described it as a whirl through endless liquid darkness, as if riding a comet's tail through spinning universes, diving from the moon into some bottomless pit, and back again, while all around, the insane laughter of ancient gods echoed, joined by the flapping of green, bat-winged creatures from the depths of hell. Out of that nightmare came rescue, the Vigilant, the Vice-Admiralty Court, the streets of Dunedin, and the long journey back to his home by the Egerberg. Johansson couldn't speak of what had happened. People would have thought he'd gone mad, so he decided to write down everything he knew before death came. But even then he made sure his wife wouldn't understand it. Death, he hoped, might at least erase the memories. That was the document I read. I've now placed it inside the metal box, alongside the stone carving and Professor Angel's notes. My own account will go with it, this written record of my own struggle to stay sane, where I have pieced together truths that I hope no one will ever piece together again. I have seen the worst horrors the universe can offer, and even the blue skies of spring or the flowers of summer can never feel pure again. But I don't believe I have much time left. Just as my uncle died, just as poor Johansson died, so too shall I. I know too much, and the cult is still out there. Cthulhu still lives too, I suppose, buried once more in that awful stone chasm where he has waited since before the dawn of time. His cursed city has sunk again, for the Vigilant passed over the spot after the April storm. But his servants still dance, chant, and kill beneath the moonlight around their stone idols in lonely, forgotten places. He must have been trapped inside the sunken city when it fell, or else by now the world would be screaming in terror and madness. Who can say what the future holds? What rises may sink, and what sinks may rise again. Foul things dream in the deep, and rot creeps through the crumbling cities of humankind. A day will come, but I must not think about it. I can't think about it. Let me only pray that, if I don't survive long enough to destroy this manuscript myself, whoever finds it will be cautious, more cautious than brave, and make sure it is never seen by another living soul. The end.